Settle into the quiet folds of your blanket, dear listener, as we drift gently into a forgotten world where East met West, not through war, but through whispers of culture, trade, and knowledge. Tonight, we unravel the soft-spoken tale of the Hellenistic world, the peaceful echoes that followed Alexander's thunder. From the shining libraries of Alexandria to the curious blending of Greek and Egyptian gods, this is the story of a world transformed, where empires fractured, but ideas flourished. Let the clink of ancient coins, the murmur of scholars, and the slow turning of scrolls ease your mind into restful sleep. Before we begin tracing the silken threads of the Hellenistic dream, remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to drift off with us every week to a different page of sleepy history. And let us know in the comments, which ancient empire would you like to explore under the stars next? Your dreams guide our stories. The morning mist still clung to the eastern harbour when the first shipment of papyrus arrived at the administrative complex of Alexandria. You could set your sundial by it every third day of the Egyptian month. The barges from the Nile Delta would drift into the royal docks, their holds packed tight with scrolls harvested from the marshlands of the lower river. The clerks knew this routine intimately, from the senior epistolographos who oversaw the royal correspondence to the lowest hypomnematographos who spent his days copying memoranda in cramped script. The chief archivist, a Macedonian named Demetrius who had followed the Ptolemaic court from its early days in Memphis, stood at the dock with his tablet and stylus ready. He had mastered the art of appearing patient while mentally calculating the workload ahead. Each bundle of papyrus represented hours of sorting, cataloguing, and filing, not the sort of work that would earn him statues or inscriptions, but the essential labor that kept the greatest library in the known world functioning. The dock workers, themselves part of the vast bureaucratic apparatus that stretched from the Nile cataracts to the Cyrenian border, handled the scrolls with practiced care. They knew that damage to a single roll could mean days of work lost, and the royal anger of Ptolemy II was not something any man wished to experience. The papyrus came in various qualities: heavy sheets for legal documents that would need to withstand decades of reference, lighter rolls for correspondence that might be consulted only a handful of times before being archived, and the finest Egyptian paper for the works that would grace the library's main collection. As the bundles were unloaded, Demetrius made his initial notations. He would need to separate the administrative documents, tax records from the nomes, correspondence from diplomatic missions, military reports from the Syrian frontier, from the literary works that scholars across the Greek world sent to Alexandria in hopes of immortalization. The library's reputation had spread far beyond Egypt's borders, and every month brought new manuscripts from Athens, Rhodes, even distant Syracuse, each hoping to find a place among the 500,000 scrolls already housed in the royal complex. The morning light grew stronger, casting long shadows from the lighthouse that dominated the harbour entrance. Demetrius had watched that lighthouse being built over the past decade, stone by carefully measured stone, its fire platform rising higher each month. It served as a constant reminder of the scale of a Ptolemaic ambition, not just to rule Egypt, but to become the intellectual centre of the Mediterranean world. And that ambition required an army of bureaucrats, each performing tasks that historians would never record, but which history itself depended upon. The first cartloads of papyrus began their journey up the marble steps to the administrative offices. Demetrius followed, his mind already anticipating the day's challenges. There would be petitions to review from Greek settlers whose land grants had been miscalculated, correspondence to draft for the Dioeketes regarding grain shipments to Rhodes, and new scrolls to catalogue for the library's ever-expanding collection. Each document required the proper official seal, the correct genealogical notation, the appropriate level of formality based on the recipient's status and relationship to the crown. In the offices above, dozens of clerks bent over their work, their reed pens scratching against papyrus in the rhythmic pattern that had become the soundtrack of Ptolemaic administration. The air carried the distinctive scent of fresh papyrus mixed with the ink they prepared each morning from soot and gum Arabic. Some copied documents that would be sent to provincial governors, others translated Egyptian records into Greek for the royal archives, and still others prepared the elaborate genealogies that the Ptolemies required to maintain their Macedonian credentials while ruling over ancient Egypt. The room assigned to land records was particularly busy this morning. One wall was lined with wooden pigeonholes, each containing scrolls related to specific nomes of Egypt. The system had been refined over decades, with each document cross-referenced to related materials, tax assessments, irrigation records, census data, boundary disputes. A clerk named Apollodorus was explaining to a junior colleague how to trace the ownership history of a particular plot in the Fayum region, moving through multiple scrolls with practiced efficiency. The process required understanding not just the Greek legal terminology, but the Egyptian methods of land measurement that had governed the Nile Valley for 3 millennia. The morning's work was interrupted by the arrival of a courier from the palace, bearing royal correspondence that required immediate attention. The message was sealed with the double cartouche of Ptolemy Thakun and his sister wife Arsinoe, a reminder of the dynasty's determination to present themselves as both Macedonian monarchs and legitimate pharaohs. The courier's scroll contained instructions for the library's expansion. New acquisitions from Athens, including the complete works of the tragedians, required special handling and cataloguing. The king's own scholars would be reviewing these acquisitions, ensuring they met the standards of Alexandria's collection. As Demetrius unrolled the royal message, he noted its position in the complex web of Ptolemaic administration. Even this simple communication had passed through multiple hands: the king's secretary, the royal epistolographos, the palace archive, and finally the courier who had carried it across Alexandria's busy streets. Each transfer was recorded, each hand that touched the document noted in the margins, creating a chain of accountability that stretched back through the bureaucratic hierarchy. This was the invisible infrastructure of empire, the paper trail that ensured commands were followed and records were maintained. The afternoon brought its own particular rhythm. In the room dedicated to foreign correspondence, clerks prepared copies of treaties with neighboring kingdoms, each document requiring perfect Greek on the recto's side and careful translation into Egyptian on the verso. The process required not just linguistic skill but diplomatic sensitivity. Certain Greek concepts had no direct Egyptian equivalent, and the bureaucrats had developed elaborate circumlocutions to convey meaning without causing offense. These documents would eventually find their way to the library's collection, where scholars would study them for insights into international relations, but for now they were working documents, essential to the daily functioning of Ptolemaic diplomacy. The library's scholars, men like Zenodotus and Callimachus, worked in separate quarters, but their needs drove much of the administrative activity. When Zenodotus requested manuscripts of Homer from different cities for comparison, it required coordination with the diplomatic service, which negotiated with foreign courts for loans of precious texts. When Callimachus needed information about obscure poets for his Pinnaces, the universal catalogue he was compiling, clerks searched through accumulated correspondence and tax records for mentions of literary figures. The scholars thought in terms of knowledge and beauty, but their work depended on the mundane world of shipping manifests and diplomatic correspondence. As the sun began to set over the harbour, Demetrius reviewed the day's production. Dozens of scrolls had been processed, copied, catalogued, and filed. New documents had arrived from across the kingdom, each requiring its place in the vast archival system. The library had grown by perhaps a dozen new acquisitions, each meticulously catalogued according to the system that Callimachus had refined. Tax records had been updated, correspondence dispatched to provincial governors, and royal orders transmitted through the appropriate channels. It was the kind of day that would never be mentioned in histories of the Ptolemaic dynasty, but without which no history could have been written at all. The clerks extinguished their oil lamps and prepared to leave for their homes in the Greek quarter of Alexandria. They were men of modest means, these bureaucrats, but they understood that their work connected them to something larger than themselves. Each document they processed, each record they maintained, was a thread in the vast tapestry of Ptolemaic administration. Tomorrow the barges would arrive again with fresh papyrus, and the cycle would continue. The library would grow, the kingdom would function, and the careful work of bureaucrats would keep the machinery of empire running smoothly. But as Demetrius locked the administrative offices for the night, he knew that challenges lay ahead. The system they had built was not without its flaws. Corruption was endemic. Officials sometimes altered records for personal gain, merchants bribed clerks to avoid taxes, and even within the library itself, accusations of forgery and misattribution circulated regularly. The elaborate safeguards built into the administrative system were themselves subject to manipulation by those who understood them too well. How long could the careful balance of Greek efficiency and Egyptian tradition maintain itself under the weight of human frailty and ambition? The problem of organization grew more complex with each passing month. Zenodotus, the library's first chief librarian, had established a system that seemed elegant in its simplicity. Scrolls arranged by subject matter in separate rooms, then organized by type within those rooms, and finally shelved alphabetically by author's name. But as the collection swelled past 200,000 scrolls, even this system struggled to accommodate the variety of knowledge flowing into Alexandria. Manuscripts arrived from India containing astronomical observations that challenged Greek cosmology, philosophical treatises from Syria that blended Eastern mysticism with Platonic reasoning, and medical texts from Sicily that contradicted the established teachings of the Hippocratic school. Callimachus, a scholar from Cyrene whose energy for cataloguing seemed superhuman to his colleagues, spent his days moving through the library's various chambers with the methodical patience of a tax collector. He carried with him wax tablets on which he recorded not just the titles and authors of works, but their opening lines, total length, and philosophical orientation. His goal was nothing less than to create a universal bibliography, the Pinnaces, that would serve as the key to all human knowledge. It was tedious work, requiring him to unroll each scroll far enough to determine its contents, then roll it back carefully to avoid damage. The process took hours for longer works, and some days he managed to catalogue only a handful of manuscripts. The challenge was not merely organizational but philosophical. How should one categorize a text that claimed to be both history and mythology? Where should philosophical dialogues that contained extensive mathematical proofs be shelved? The Greek system of knowledge, developed over centuries of philosophical inquiry, was proving inadequate for the multicultural reality of the Hellenistic world. Callimachus found himself creating new categories: syncretic works, comparative studies, translated foreign texts, that would have been meaningless to his predecessors in classical Athens. The physical arrangement of the library reflected these intellectual challenges. The main reading room, with its soaring columns and natural light filtered through high windows, contained the core collection of Greek literature, the epics of Homer, the tragedies of the Athenian masters, the philosophical works that formed the foundation of Hellenic education. But branching off from this central space were specialized chambers devoted to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and what the librarians termed barbarian wisdom. These rooms grew increasingly crowded as diplomatic missions returned, with texts from distant courts and merchants brought back, manuscripts acquired during their trading voyages. The cataloging process required collaboration with the kingdom's diplomatic service. When Ptolemy's ambassadors returned from the Seleucid court with copies of Babylonian astronomical records, they arrived with letters of introduction that explained the text's provenance and significance. These diplomatic communications became essential metadata, providing context that helped librarians understand manuscripts written in languages and traditions foreign to Greek scholarship. The system was imperfect, ambassadors were not scholars, and their descriptions sometimes mixed factual observation with diplomatic flattery, but it was better than the alternative of receiving texts with no context whatsoever. The library's scribes faced their own particular challenges. Each manuscript had to be copied by hand, a process that could take weeks for longer works. The scribes worked in shifts, bent over their desks in rooms where the air was thick with the smell of ink and the sound of scratching pens. They were expected to maintain perfect accuracy, but human error was inevitable. When mistakes were discovered, the entire copying process might need to begin again. Some scribes developed specialized expertise. Those who could read Egyptian hieroglyphs were in constant demand for copying religious texts, while others became expert in the various scripts used for different Greek dialects. Their work was essential to the library's function, but their names rarely appeared in the records they helped create. The question of authenticity haunted the cataloging process. In the competitive intellectual environment of Alexandria, where scholars competed for royal patronage and international reputation, the temptation to forge or alter texts was constant. The library received works attributed to famous authors that internal evidence suggested were composed much later than claimed. Philosophical treatises appeared bearing the names of long-dead thinkers, but containing concepts that had only recently developed. The librarians developed techniques for detecting forgeries, checking the consistency of language, cross-referencing with other known works, examining the physical characteristics of the papyrus and ink, but the process was time-consuming and often inconclusive. The financial aspects of library administration required their own careful attention. Each scroll represented a significant investment. The papyrus itself, the labor of copying, the housing requirements, the administrative time devoted to cataloging. The Ptolemaic dynasty funded the library generously, but even royal resources were finite. Decisions had to be made about which works to copy, which to acquire, and which to decline. These choices had philosophical implications. What knowledge was worth preserving? What texts deserved the expense of copying and housing? The librarians found themselves acting as intellectual gatekeepers, determining which voices from the vast chorus of human thought would be amplified for future generations. The international scope of the collection created diplomatic complications. When the library sought to acquire copies of Homer's works from different cities, it required delicate negotiations with local authorities who might view their texts as sacred relics rather than scholarly resources. Some cities demanded reciprocal privileges, access to Alexandrian collections, or royal support for their own intellectual projects. The librarians found themselves involved in complex negotiations that blended scholarship with statecraft, trying to balance the kingdom's intellectual ambitions with its diplomatic relationships. These discussions could stretch over months, with multiple rounds of correspondence and envoys traveling between courts. The physical challenges of housing the collection grew with each passing year. The library occupied multiple buildings throughout the royal quarter, each requiring careful climate control to protect the papyrus from Alexandria's humid air. The librarians learned through painful experience that certain locations were prone to flooding during the annual Nile inundation, while others received too much direct sunlight, causing the ink to fade. They developed techniques for preservation, special oils to treat the papyrus, particular arrangements of scrolls within their storage bins, regular inspection schedules to detect early signs of deterioration. These practical concerns were as important to the library's survival as the intellectual work of cataloging and scholarship. The question of access created its own bureaucratic maze. The library was theoretically open to scholars from across the Greek world, but in practice, access required navigating administrative procedures that could confound even experienced researchers. Foreign scholars needed letters of introduction from their home cities, proof of their educational credentials, and sometimes personal interviews with library officials. Once granted access, They were assigned specific reading rooms and given strict rules about handling manuscripts. The librarians had learned through experience that not all visitors were equally careful with the collection. Some scrolls arrived back with water damage, others with annotations added in unauthorized hands. A few simply disappeared. The system of controls was elaborate but necessary. As Callimachus worked through his daily cataloguing, he contemplated the larger significance of his task. He was creating order from chaos, imposing human understanding on the vast profusion of knowledge that the Hellenistic world had made possible. But he was also making choices that would echo through history, deciding which works to preserve, which authors to highlight, which connections between ideas to emphasize. The Pinakes would become a map of human knowledge, but every map required the mapmaker to decide what was important enough to include. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, when the library's reading rooms were filled with the soft sounds of scholarship, these philosophical questions seemed as real as the papyrus scrolls that surrounded him. But the work was never finished. Each ship that arrived in Alexandria's harbor might carry new manuscripts. Each diplomatic mission might return with texts that challenged existing categories. Each scholarly discovery might require revisions to the cataloging system. The library was not a static monument, but a living organism, growing and changing with the intellectual life of the Hellenistic world. The bureaucrats who maintained it understood that their work would never be complete, that each solution created new problems, that each system of organization would eventually be challenged by the very knowledge it sought to organize. How long could this delicate balance between order and expansion be maintained? The administrative burden grew exponentially as the Ptolemaic dynasty extended its reach across the eastern Mediterranean. Each new territory brought its own system of record-keeping, its own weights and measures, its own languages and scripts that had to be integrated into the Alexandrian system. The bureaucrats who managed the library's expansion found themselves learning Carian numerical systems, understanding Phoenician commercial practices, and mastering the diplomatic protocols of kingdoms that had existed for centuries before Alexander's conquests made them part of the Hellenistic world. What had begun as a project to organize Greek knowledge had become something far more ambitious, the creation of a universal system that could accommodate the intellectual traditions of Asia, Africa, and Europe. The physical demands of the collection eventually required architectural innovation. The original library buildings, designed around the traditional Greek model of rectangular rooms with colonnaded perimeters, proved inadequate for the growing collection. Architects from across the Hellenistic world were summoned to Alexandria to design new storage solutions. Underground chambers that maintained consistent humidity, circular reading rooms that maximized natural light, multi-story structures that could house hundreds of thousands of scrolls while remaining accessible to scholars. The construction required coordination between Egyptian engineers who understood the local climate, Greek architects who knew the principles of public building, and the library's own staff who could specify the practical requirements of housing manuscripts. The financial challenges reached crisis proportions during the reign of Ptolemy IV, when military campaigns in Syria and diplomatic entanglements with Rome drained the royal treasury. The library's administrators received instructions to reduce acquisitions, to be more selective in copying manuscripts, to generate revenue through the sale of duplicate texts. These directives created moral dilemmas for the librarians who had dedicated their lives to preserving knowledge. How could they choose between texts, which duplicates were truly unnecessary? What works might be lost forever if they declined to copy them? The decisions they made during these years would determine what survived for future generations. But they had no way of knowing which choices would prove historically significant. The question of language became increasingly complex as the collection expanded. The library's founders had assumed that Greek would serve as the universal language of scholarship, but they discovered that translation created its own problems. Mathematical concepts that worked elegantly in Greek became cumbersome when rendered into Egyptian hieroglyphs. Medical terminology developed in different traditions used the same words to describe different conditions. Philosophical arguments lost subtlety when moved between languages with different conceptual frameworks. The librarians found themselves becoming linguists and cultural mediators, trying to preserve not just the content of texts, but the intellectual context that gave them meaning. The international reputation of the library created diplomatic pressures that extended far beyond Alexandria's walls. When Roman senators requested copies of specific texts, the librarians had to balance scholarly cooperation with political caution. When Seleucid scholars asked for access to Babylonian astronomical records, they had to consider whether sharing such knowledge might provide military advantages to potential enemies. The library had become not just a repository of knowledge, but a strategic asset in the complex politics of the Hellenistic world. The bureaucrats who managed its collections found themselves making decisions that affected relationships between kingdoms, each choice rippling outward through networks of alliance and rivalry. As Callimachus worked through his daily cataloguing, he contemplated the larger significance of his task. He was creating order from chaos, imposing human understanding on the vast profusion of knowledge that the Hellenistic world had made possible. But he was also making choices that would echo through history, deciding which works to preserve, which authors to highlight, which connections between ideas to emphasize. The Pinarches would become a map of human knowledge, but every map required the mapmaker to decide what was important enough to include. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, when the library's reading rooms were filled with the soft sounds of scholarship, these philosophical questions seemed as real as the papyrus scrolls that surrounded him. But the work was never finished. Each ship that arrived in Alexandria's harbor might carry new manuscripts. Each diplomatic mission might return with texts that challenged existing categories. Each scholarly discovery might require revisions to the cataloging system. The library was not a static monument, but a living organism, growing and changing with the intellectual life of the Hellenistic world. The bureaucrats who maintained it understood that their work would never be complete, that each solution created new problems, that each system of organization would eventually be challenged by the very knowledge it sought to organize. How long could this delicate balance between order and expansion be maintained? The administrative burden grew exponentially as the Ptolemaic dynasty extended its reach across the eastern Mediterranean. Each new territory brought its own system of record-keeping, its own weights and measures, its own languages and scripts that had to be integrated into the Alexandrian system. The bureaucrats who managed the library's expansion found themselves learning Carian numerical systems, understanding Phoenician commercial practices, and mastering the diplomatic protocols of kingdoms that had existed for centuries before Alexander's conquests made them part of the Hellenistic world. What had begun as a project to organize Greek knowledge had become something far more ambitious, the creation of a universal system that could accommodate the intellectual traditions of Asia, Africa, and Europe. The physical demands of the collection eventually required architectural innovation. The original library buildings, designed around the traditional Greek model of rectangular rooms with colonnaded perimeters, proved inadequate for the growing collection. Architects from across the Hellenistic world were summoned to Alexandria to design new storage solutions: underground chambers that maintained consistent humidity, circular reading rooms that maximized natural light, multi-story structures that could house hundreds of thousands of scrolls while remaining accessible to scholars. The construction required coordination between Egyptian engineers who understood the local climate, Greek architects who knew the principles of public building, and the library's own staff who could specify the practical requirements of housing manuscripts. The financial challenges reached crisis proportions during the reign of Ptolemy IV, when military campaigns in Syria and diplomatic entanglements with Rome drained the royal treasury. The library's administrators received instructions to reduce acquisitions, to be more selective in copying manuscripts, to generate revenue through the sale of duplicate texts. These directives created moral dilemmas for the librarians who had dedicated their lives to preserving knowledge. How could they choose between texts? which duplicates were truly unnecessary. What works might be lost forever if they declined to copy them? The decisions they made during these years would determine what survived for future generations. But they had no way of knowing which choices would prove historically significant. The question of language became increasingly complex as the collection expanded. The library's founders had assumed that Greek would serve as the universal language of scholarship, but they discovered that translation created its own problems. Mathematical concepts that worked elegantly in Greek became cumbersome when rendered into Egyptian hieroglyphs. Medical terminology developed in different traditions used the same words to describe different conditions. Philosophical arguments lost subtlety when moved between languages with different conceptual frameworks. The librarians found themselves becoming linguists and cultural mediators, trying to preserve not just the content of texts, but the intellectual context that gave them meaning. The international reputation of the library created diplomatic pressures that extended far beyond Alexandria's walls. When Roman senators requested copies of specific texts, the librarians had to balance scholarly cooperation with political caution. When Seleucid scholars asked for access to Babylonian astronomical records, they had to consider whether sharing such knowledge might provide military advantages to potential enemies. The library had become not just a repository of knowledge, but a strategic asset in the complex politics of the Hellenistic world. The bureaucrats who managed its collections found themselves making decisions that affected relationships between kingdoms, each choice rippling outward through networks of alliance and rivalry. The technical challenges of manuscript preservation required increasing specialization. The librarians learned that different inks had different lifespans, that certain combinations of papyrus and ink were more stable than others, that the angle of storage affected the longevity of scrolls. They developed techniques for repairing damaged manuscripts, for removing mold, for protecting texts from the insects that thrived in Alexandria's climate. These practical skills became as important as literary knowledge. A scholar might spend years studying Aristotle's philosophy, but it was the technicians who ensured that Aristotle's words would survive to be studied. The library's success depended on both kinds of expertise. The personal toll on the library's staff was considerable. The work required patience beyond what most people could sustain. Hours spent copying texts, days devoted to cataloging, years invested in learning foreign scripts and systems of knowledge. Many of the bureaucrats developed physical ailments from their work: eye strain from reading in poor light, back problems from hunching over desks, repetitive stress injuries from the constant motion of writing. They worked for modest salaries, their names rarely appearing in the documents they processed, their contributions invisible to the scholars who used the library's collections. But they understood that they were part of something larger than themselves, that their patient labor was preserving the intellectual heritage of civilizations. The administrative system they had created was not immune to the political instability that characterized the later Hellenistic period. Changes in royal policy, court intrigue, and eventually the Roman conquest of Egypt all affected the library's operations. Officials came and went, bringing new priorities and administrative practices. The systematic approach developed by the early Ptolemies sometimes gave way to more chaotic management, with inconsistent cataloging and gaps in the collection. The bureaucrats who remained through these transitions found themselves trying to maintain standards while adapting to new requirements. Their elaborate systems sometimes reduced to pragmatic improvisation. Yet the foundation they had built proved remarkably durable. The organizational principles developed by Zenodotus and refined by Callimachus influenced library design for centuries. The techniques for manuscript preservation they pioneered were passed down through generations of scribes. The very concept of a universal library, a place where all human knowledge could be collected and organized, became a model that would inspire similar institutions throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. The bureaucrats who never wrote great works themselves had created the conditions that made great scholarship possible. As Alexandria entered its Roman period, the library's administrative systems gradually adapted to new political realities. The detailed record-keeping that had served Ptolemaic purposes found new uses under Roman administration. The cataloging principles developed for organizing Greek knowledge proved adaptable to Latin texts. The international networks of scholarship established during the Hellenistic period continued to function under Roman oversight. The bureaucrats who maintained these systems had built something that transcended the political changes of kingdoms and empires, a method for preserving and organizing human knowledge that would influence library science for millennia. But perhaps their greatest achievement was simply their persistence. In a world of constant warfare, political upheaval, and social change, they had maintained the patient disciplines required for serious scholarship. They had processed millions of documents, catalogued hundreds of thousands of texts, created systems that allowed knowledge to be preserved and transmitted across cultures and centuries. Their names are forgotten, their individual contributions lost to history, but their collective achievement survives in every library that continues their work. The question that remains is whether future civilizations will value their patient labor as much as we benefit from its results today. The annual flood arrived with the precision that made Egypt the wonder of the ancient world, and with it came the complex mathematics of grain distribution that would occupy the next 6 months of merchant life. You could measure the prosperity of the Ptolemaic kingdom by the height of the Nile's inundation. The difference between 12 and 16 cubits at Memphis determined whether merchants would be calculating surplus or shortage, profit or loss, survival or starvation for millions throughout the Mediterranean world. The clerks who worked in the grain offices of Alexandria understood these calculations intimately, their professional lives governed by the same astronomical rhythms that had ordered Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years. The chief grain merchant, a Greek named Philon who had spent 30 years mastering the complexities of Egyptian agriculture, began each flood season with the same methodical survey. His subordinates fanned out across the Nile Valley, traveling by river barge and donkey caravan to inspect the granaries of each nome. They measured remaining stores from the previous harvest, calculated expected yields based on the flood's extent, and recorded their findings on papyrus tablets that would eventually make their way back to Alexandria. The process required understanding not just Greek mathematics but Egyptian methods of land measurement, the various strains of wheat and barley cultivated in different regions, and the complex system of land ownership that included royal estates, temple properties, military allotments, and private farms. The administrative system that governed this process had been refined over 2 centuries of Ptolemaic rule. Each nome had its own grain officials appointed by the royal administration and responsible for maintaining detailed records of agricultural production. These officials supervised local granaries, managed the transportation networks that moved grain from rural areas to urban centers, and ensured that the royal share of each harvest reached Alexandria's harbor. Their work required coordination with irrigation engineers who maintained the canal systems, tax collectors who assessed agricultural productivity, and local magistrates who resolved disputes between farmers and landlords. The entire system functioned through paperwork, papyrus documents that recorded every transaction, every shipment, every debt or credit in the vast accounting system that kept Egypt fed and the Ptolemaic treasury solvent. The morning's first task involved reviewing the reports that had arrived overnight from upriver. Philon sat in his office overlooking the great harbor, surrounded by baskets of papyrus that contained the agricultural intelligence of an entire kingdom. The documents arrived in various languages and scripts: Greek for official correspondence, Egyptian hieratic for temple records, Demotic for local business transactions, sometimes even Aramaic for documents originating in the Syro-Palestinian territories that Egypt controlled. The grain merchant had learned to read enough of each to extract the essential information about crop conditions, expected yields, and transportation problems that might affect the grain trade. It was the kind of linguistic versatility that Alexandrian merchants developed out of necessity, their professional success depending on the ability to navigate multiple cultural and administrative systems. The harbour itself provided constant evidence of the scale of Ptolemaic grain trade. Massive granaries lined the waterfront, their mud brick walls thick enough to maintain stable temperatures for long-term storage. The largest of these structures, built during the reign of Ptolemy II, could hold enough grain to feed Alexandria for a year and still have surplus for export. The architectural design reflected sophisticated understanding of preservation, ventilation systems that prevented moisture accumulation, elevation that protected against flooding, access routes that allowed efficient loading onto ships. Construction had required coordination between Egyptian engineers who understood the local climate, Greek architects familiar with large-scale building projects, and specialists in grain storage who knew how to prevent spoilage in quantities that would have been unimaginable in classical Athens. The day's most pressing concern involved a shipment of wheat that had been delayed by canal maintenance in the Arsinoe Nome. The irrigation system that made Egyptian agriculture possible required constant upkeep, dredging to remove silt, repair of embankments damaged by floodwaters, replacement of wooden sluice gates that controlled water flow. These maintenance projects were scheduled for the dry season, when water levels were lowest, but they inevitably disrupted the transportation networks that moved grain from interior farms to the coast. Philon had spent the morning calculating alternative routes, consulting with barge captains about capacity limitations, and negotiating with other merchants who might be persuaded to share transportation costs for mutual benefit. The calculations involved understanding not just geography, but the complex web of relationships that connected everyone involved in the grain trade, from royal officials who set policy to local boatmen who knew every sandbar and current along the Nile. The administrative paperwork required for each shipment reflected the Ptolemaic dynasty's determination to maintain central control over Egypt's agricultural wealth. Every transaction required multiple copies of documents, one for the royal archives, one for the nome officials, one for the grain merchant, and sometimes additional copies for temple authorities or military officials who had interests in particular estates. The documents themselves were marvels of bureaucratic thoroughness, recording not just the quantity and quality of grain, but its origin, the method of cultivation, the taxes paid at each stage of production, and the anticipated route for transportation to Alexandria. This paperwork created the administrative trail that allowed the royal administration to monitor agricultural production throughout Egypt and ensure that the kingdom's most valuable resource was properly accounted for. The afternoon brought a meeting with representatives from several Rhodian trading houses who had arrived in Alexandria to negotiate contracts for the coming year. Rhodes, an island whose prosperity depended on its role as a commercial hub, purchased enormous quantities of Egyptian grain for redistribution throughout the Aegean. The negotiations required understanding not just current market conditions, but the complex diplomatic relationship between Ptolemaic Egypt and the independent city-states that controlled the eastern Mediterranean. Rhodes maintained its independence through careful diplomacy, balancing relationships with the major Hellenistic kingdoms while serving as a neutral ground for commercial exchange. The grain merchants who represented Rhodes were skilled negotiators who understood that their city's strategic position gave them leverage in price discussions, but they also knew that Egypt's agricultural surplus made it the indispensable partner in Mediterranean trade networks. The pricing calculations involved factors that would have been familiar to any merchant in any age: supply and demand, transportation costs, storage expenses, risks of loss through spoilage or piracy. But they also included considerations unique to the Hellenistic world: the royal monopoly on certain categories of grain, the requirement to provide preferential pricing for allied cities, the necessity of maintaining strategic reserves for military campaigns or diplomatic gifts. The Ptolemies understood that grain was not just a commodity, but a tool of statecraft, a means of maintaining relationships with cities and kingdoms that might provide military support or commercial access. The merchants who managed this trade found themselves operating at the intersection of private profit and public policy, their commercial decisions affecting the diplomatic relationships that determined the stability of the Hellenistic world. The technical aspects of grain quality assessment required expertise that Alexandria's merchants had developed over generations. They could judge the percentage of foreign matter in a sample, determine the moisture content that would affect storage life, identify the particular strain of wheat and its suitability for different culinary uses. They understood which grains would command premium prices in Athens, where citizens preferred high-quality wheat for bread, versus which would be acceptable in the rougher markets of northern Greece, where barley often served as the staple grain. This knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship systems that connected experienced merchants with younger men learning the trade, creating professional networks that spanned the Mediterranean and ensured that expertise accumulated over decades was not lost to age or misfortune. As evening approached, Philon reviewed his calculations for the 1,000th time. The numbers represented more than commercial transactions. They were the mathematics of survival for millions of people who depended on Egyptian grain for their daily bread. The Ptolemaic system had created the most efficient agricultural production and distribution network in the ancient world, capable of moving enormous quantities of grain from Nile Valley farms to Mediterranean markets with remarkable speed and reliability. But the system's very efficiency created new vulnerabilities. Disruption at any point in the complex chain of production, transportation, and distribution could have cascading effects that reached far beyond Egypt's borders. Tomorrow he would send his representatives to negotiate with barge captains, temple officials, and nome administrators, each meeting a small piece in the vast puzzle of feeding the Hellenistic world. The question that troubled him as he prepared for another season of calculations was whether the delicate balance they had achieved could be sustained indefinitely, or whether the system's very complexity made it vulnerable to disruption in ways they had not yet anticipated. The complexity of grain distribution reached its peak during the sailing season, when hundreds of ships departed Alexandria's harbor each week, carrying Egyptian wheat to markets throughout the Mediterranean. The coordination required for this massive undertaking involved calculations that would have challenged the most sophisticated mathematicians of the ancient world. Each ship's departure had to be timed according to wind patterns, sea conditions, and the sailing schedules of naval escorts that protected convoys from pirates. The vessels themselves varied enormously in size and capacity, from small coastal traders that could carry 50 tons of grain to massive grain ships that displaced several hundred tons and required specialized harbors for loading and unloading. The merchants who organized these shipments had to match cargo to vessel, route to season, and crew to destination with the precision that modern logistics companies would recognize as the foundation of successful operation. The financial instruments that facilitated this trade represented innovations that would influence commercial practice for centuries. Letters of credit allowed merchants to conduct business across vast distances without transporting precious metals that might be lost to pirates or confiscated by hostile authorities. Insurance arrangements, while primitive by modern standards, provided some protection against the risks inherent in maritime trade. Partnership agreements enabled individual merchants to share both profits and risks, creating commercial networks that could survive the loss of individual ships or cargoes. The Egyptian merchants who developed these systems understood that successful long-distance trade required not just courage and commercial acumen, but sophisticated financial arrangements that could manage risk across the extended supply chains that connected Nile Valley farms to dining tables in distant cities. The record-keeping systems that tracked these shipments had evolved into elaborate networks of documentation that created administrative trails stretching from Alexandria to the furthest reaches of the Mediterranean. Each cargo required multiple copies of shipping documents, one for the ship's captain, one for the merchant who had purchased the grain, one for the royal tax officials who monitored exports, and additional copies for the various intermediaries who might be involved in the transaction. These documents recorded not just the quantity and quality of grain, but its routing, the identity of the crew, the terms of insurance arrangements, and the expected date of arrival at various ports. The system created accountability at each stage of the distribution process, ensuring that merchants could track their investments and royal officials could monitor the movement of Egypt's most valuable export. The challenges of maintaining grain quality during long sea voyages required understanding of preservation techniques that Egyptian merchants had refined over generations. They learned which types of grain could withstand months at sea without significant deterioration, how to pack cargo holds to maximize ventilation while minimizing movement, which herbs and spices could be added to deter insects without affecting the grain's suitability for bread making. They understood the seasonal patterns that affected grain quality, the higher moisture content in grain shipped during certain months, the increased risk of spoilage during particular weather conditions, the optimal timing for loading ships to minimize exposure to damaging sea air. This knowledge was transmitted through professional associations that connected merchants across different cities, creating networks of expertise that improved the reliability of grain shipments throughout the Mediterranean. The coordination required between agricultural production and maritime transportation created scheduling challenges that tested the organizational capacities of even the most experienced merchants. Grain harvests followed seasonal patterns that were predictable but inflexible. The Nile flood determined planting schedules, and the Mediterranean climate set harvest dates with little room for adjustment. Ship availability, by contrast, was subject to variables that included weather patterns, naval requirements for military campaigns, pirate activity, and the commercial decisions of ship owners who might choose to carry other cargoes if grain prices were unfavorable. The merchants who specialized in grain trade developed systems for predicting these various factors and adjusting their plans accordingly, creating commercial calendars that balanced agricultural reality with maritime possibility. The diplomatic aspects of grain distribution required merchants to function as informal ambassadors for Ptolemaic interests throughout the Mediterranean. When they delivered grain to cities experiencing shortages, they were simultaneously providing humanitarian assistance and creating obligations that might influence political relationships. The Ptolemies understood that grain distribution was not simply a commercial transaction, but a form of soft power that could build alliances and create dependencies. Merchants who represented Egyptian interests in foreign ports had to understand not just market conditions, but the complex web of relationships that connected cities, kingdoms, and empires throughout the Hellenistic world. Their commercial decisions affected diplomatic relationships, and their personal relationships with foreign officials influenced their ability to conduct business successfully. The integration of grain trade with other aspects of Ptolemaic economic policy created systems of interdependence that extended far beyond simple agricultural commerce. The royal monopoly on certain categories of grain production generated revenue that funded military campaigns, diplomatic missions, and the cultural projects that made Alexandria the intellectual center of the Hellenistic world. Taxation of grain exports provided the financial resources that enabled the Ptolemies to maintain their elaborate court, support scholarly research at the library and museum, and fund the construction projects that demonstrated their legitimacy as successors to the pharaohs. The merchants who managed this trade understood that their commercial success was inseparable from the political stability that allowed the Ptolemaic system to function effectively. The problems of scale that emerged as the grain trade expanded created organizational challenges that required constant innovation. The quantity of grain that moved through Alexandria's harbor during peak season exceeded what individual merchants could manage through traditional methods of personal relationship and informal partnership. New systems of organization emerged, merchant associations that could coordinate the activities of dozens of traders, shared facilities for storage and loading, collective bargaining with ship owners and harbor officials, standard contracts that reduced the time required for negotiation and documentation. These innovations represented the evolution of commercial practice under the pressure of scale, creating templates for business organization that would influence trade, throughout the ancient world and beyond. The afternoons, negotiations with Rhodian representatives required understanding, not just current market conditions, but the long-term trends that would determine grain availability and pricing over the coming year. These discussions involved analysis of factors that extended far beyond Egypt's borders: population growth in Greek cities that increased demand for imported grain, political instability in regions that might disrupt trade routes, climatic variations that could affect agricultural production across the Mediterranean, military conflicts that might require reallocation of resources from commercial to strategic purposes. The merchants who specialized in grain trade developed expertise in political analysis and economic forecasting that was as sophisticated as any modern system of market research. Their decisions were based not just on immediate conditions, but on projections that required understanding connections between agriculture, politics, climate, and international relations. As another sailing season approached its midpoint, Philon contemplated the system's remarkable achievements. The Ptolemaic grain trade had created the most efficient agricultural distribution network in the ancient world, capable of moving enormous quantities of food from surplus regions to areas experiencing shortages with speed and reliability that would not be matched for centuries. But he also understood the vulnerabilities inherent in any system of such complexity. The interconnections that made the network efficient also created points of failure that could disrupt trade across vast regions. A canal blockage in Middle Egypt might affect bread prices in Athens. A diplomatic dispute between Alexandria and Rhodes might create shortages in island communities throughout the Aegean. The merchants who managed this trade had built something remarkable, but they had also created dependencies that made the entire Mediterranean world vulnerable to disruptions they could not control or predict. What would happen if the delicate balance they had achieved was challenged by forces beyond their ability to manage or influence? The vulnerabilities inherent in the Ptolemaic grain system revealed themselves gradually through a series of disruptions that tested the administrative and commercial networks that had been built over generations. The first signs of strain appeared not in dramatic failures, but in small inefficiencies that accumulated over time: delays in canal maintenance that affected transportation schedules, inconsistencies in tax assessment that discouraged production from marginal lands, gradual increases in administrative costs that reduced the competitiveness of Egyptian grain in foreign markets. These problems were manageable individually, but they reflected underlying structural challenges that would eventually threaten the system's effectiveness. The merchants who had spent their careers optimizing the grain trade found themselves dealing with complications that their established procedures could not easily resolve. The political dimensions of grain distribution became increasingly complex as the Hellenistic kingdoms entered their period of terminal decline. The relationships that had sustained the grain trade for centuries, mutually beneficial arrangements between Ptolemaic Egypt and independent cities like Rhodes, diplomatic understandings that ensured safe passage for merchant vessels, financial systems that distributed risk across multiple partners, depended on political stability that became increasingly uncertain. The rise of Rome as a Mediterranean power created new dynamics that Egyptian merchants struggled to understand and accommodate. Roman political interests often conflicted with established commercial relationships, and merchants found themselves caught between obligations to traditional partners and the necessity of adapting to new political realities. The grain trade that had functioned as a system of interlocking relationships became a network of competing interests that required constant renegotiation. The administrative costs that had been manageable when the system was first developed grew exponentially as the complexity of grain distribution increased. The elaborate documentation required for each shipment, the multiple layers of official oversight, the necessity of maintaining diplomatic relationships with dozens of cities and kingdoms, all these requirements created expenses that reduced the profitability of grain trade for everyone involved. Merchants found themselves spending more time and resources on administrative compliance and less on the commercial activities that generated profits. The system that had been designed to ensure reliable grain distribution had evolved into an administrative burden that discouraged the very trade it was intended to facilitate. The bureaucratic apparatus that had made the grain trade possible had become an obstacle to its continued effectiveness. The environmental challenges that emerged during the later Ptolemaic period created stresses that the administrative systems had never been designed to address. Changes in Nile flood patterns, perhaps resulting from climatic variations or human interference with natural systems, affected agricultural productivity in ways that the tax records and production surveys could not easily accommodate. The traditional methods for predicting harvest yields became less reliable, and the administrative systems that allocated resources based on these predictions struggled to adapt to new environmental realities. Merchants who had based their commercial decisions on generations of accumulated experience found themselves dealing with patterns that contradicted established knowledge about Egyptian agriculture. The systematic approach that had made the grain trade efficient became a rigid framework that could not accommodate the variable conditions that characterized late Ptolemaic agriculture. The financial networks that had supported the grain trade for centuries proved vulnerable to the political and economic instability that characterized the Hellenistic world's final decades. The letters of credit and insurance arrangements that allowed merchants to conduct business across vast distances depended on trust and stability that became increasingly scarce. The partnerships that had distributed risk across multiple participants broke down as individual merchants focused on short-term survival rather than long-term cooperation. The sophisticated financial instruments that had facilitated Mediterranean grain trade became liabilities when the relationships that sustained them collapsed. Merchants who had spent their careers building networks of trust found themselves operating in an environment where established relationships provided little protection against the risks that threatened their businesses. The technical knowledge that had been accumulated over generations of grain trading faced erosion as experienced merchants retired or died without passing their expertise to successors. The apprenticeship systems that had transmitted specialized knowledge about grain quality assessment, preservation techniques, and market analysis became less effective as the disruptions that affected the grain trade made traditional career paths less attractive. The specialized expertise that had made Egyptian merchants successful, understanding of Nile flood patterns, knowledge of international political relationships, familiarity with preservation techniques for long-distance shipping, gradually disappeared as the systems that had supported its development collapsed. The accumulated wisdom of centuries of grain trading was lost not through dramatic catastrophe but through the gradual abandonment of the systems that had sustained its transmission. The social consequences of grain trade disruption extended far beyond the commercial. Networks that had organized the distribution of Egyptian agricultural surplus. Cities that had depended on imported grain for their survival found themselves facing shortages that affected their political stability and social cohesion. The diplomatic relationships that had been sustained through grain distribution dissolved, removing one of the stabilizing forces that had maintained relative peace in the Mediterranean world. The populations that had grown accustomed to reliable food supplies discovered their vulnerability to disruptions in complex distribution systems they had never been required to understand. The grain trade that had supported urban civilization throughout the Hellenistic world became a source of instability that contributed to the broader crisis that marked the end of the period. As the Ptolemaic dynasty approached its final decades, the grain merchants who had built their careers on the systematic distribution of Egyptian agricultural surplus confronted the collapse of the systems that had made their work possible. The elaborate administrative apparatus that had monitored production and distribution, the commercial networks that had moved grain from Nile Valley farms to Mediterranean markets, the diplomatic relationships that had ensured safe passage for merchant vessels, all these elements of the grain trade system disintegrated under the pressure of political instability, economic disruption, and environmental change that characterized the late Hellenistic period. The sophisticated commercial civilization that had been built on Egyptian grain disappeared not through dramatic conquest or revolutionary transformation, but through the gradual abandonment of the systems that had sustained its operation. The merchants who had devoted their lives to feeding the Hellenistic world found themselves witnesses to the disappearance of the economic and political order that had made their profession possible. Their expertise and relationships rendered obsolete by the transformation of the world they had helped to build. What lessons might their experience offer for understanding the relationship between complex economic systems and the political stability that such systems both require and help to create? The morning mist rose from the Euphrates as the village scribe began his daily ritual of documentation, bending over clay tablets that would record the agricultural activities, tax obligations, and social relationships that defined life in this small Mesopotamian community. You could measure the administrative reach of the Seleucid Empire by the systematic thoroughness with which its scribes documented even the most mundane aspects of village existence. Every field planted, every animal born, every marriage arranged, every debt incurred found its way into the careful cuneiform script that connected this isolated settlement to the vast bureaucratic apparatus that stretched from the Aegean coast to the Hindu Kush. The scribe who performed this work understood that his tablets would eventually travel hundreds of miles to regional administrative centers, where officials who had never seen his village would make decisions based on the accuracy of his recordings and the completeness of his documentation. The scribe himself was a product of the cultural synthesis that characterized Seleucid administration. Cetite, a Greek-speaking official who had learned to write both cuneiform and Aramaic, trained in accounting methods that blended Babylonian traditions developed over millennia with Greek innovations introduced after Alexander's conquests. His name, Antiochus, reflected his Macedonian education, but his daily work required understanding of Mesopotamian agricultural cycles, property inheritance patterns, and social customs that predated Greek presence in the region by centuries. He represented the empire's determination to impose Greek administrative efficiency on ancient civilizations whose complexity challenged the categories and procedures that had been developed for managing Macedonian kingdoms. In the Aegean world, the physical setting of his work reflected the layers of civilization that characterized Seleucid Mesopotamia. The village occupied land that had been continuously inhabited for over 3,000 years. Its fields irrigated by canal systems first constructed by Sumerian engineers and maintained by successive empires, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, and now Macedonian. The administrative center, where Antiochus worked, occupied a mud brick building whose foundations incorporated bricks stamped with the names of kings who had ruled Mesopotamia before the Greek language existed. The storage rooms that housed completed tablets contained documents written in languages that had been dead for centuries, their content still legible to scholars who understood the cuneiform script that had preserved Mesopotamian civilization through conquest and cultural transformation. The morning's first task involved updating the agricultural register that tracked land usage. Throughout the village's territory, the system required recording not just what crops had been planted in each field, but the complex patterns of land ownership that reflected generations of inheritance, marriage, and property transaction. Mesopotamian property law, refined over millennia of agricultural civilization, recognized multiple forms of ownership: outright possession, sharecropping arrangements, temple endowments, royal grants, and various forms of leasehold that created layers of obligation between landowners and cultivators. The scribe's documentation had to capture these relationships with the precision necessary for tax assessment, legal dispute resolution, and military conscription, functions that connected his village to the wider imperial system. The integration of Greek administrative practices with Mesopotamian social structures created challenges that required constant adaptation and compromise. The Seleucid Empire's fiscal system was based on principles developed in Macedonia and Greece: direct taxation of property, systematic census of population, standardized weights and measures, that functioned effectively in societies where individual ownership and market exchange were fundamental organizing principles. But Mesopotamian village society operated according to different logics, where family relationships, religious obligations, and customary practices created rights and responsibilities that the Greek categories of ownership and citizenship could not easily accommodate. The scribe's daily work required translating between these different systems of social organization, creating documentation that satisfied Greek administrative requirements while acknowledging Mesopotamian social realities. The language of administration reflected these cultural complexities. Official correspondence arrived in Greek, the language of imperial administration, but local transactions required facility with Aramaic, the lingua franca of Mesopotamian commerce, and sometimes with older languages like Akkadian or Sumerian that continued to be used for religious and scholarly purposes. The scribe had learned to code switch between these different linguistic registers, writing Greek when addressing provincial officials, but reverting to Aramaic when recording local business transactions. This multilingual facility was not merely practical, but political. The languages of administration carried different kinds of authority and legitimacy, and the choice of which language to use in particular contexts could affect how documents were interpreted and which systems of law would be applied to particular situations. The documentation systems employed by Seleucid administration required understanding of both the clay tablet technology that had served Mesopotamian bureaucracies for millennia and the papyrus-based record-keeping that Greek administrators preferred for certain types of correspondence. The scribe's training had included both forms of writing, and his daily work required choosing between them based on the nature of the information being recorded and the intended audience for particular documents. Clay tablets preserved well in Mesopotamia's dry climate and provided permanent records that could not be easily altered, making them ideal for legal documents and tax records. Papyrus, imported from Egypt at considerable expense, was more suitable for correspondence that might need to be transported over long distances or stored for extended periods. The choice between these different writing materials was not merely technical, but reflected different concepts of administrative authority and historical memory. As the morning progressed, Antiochus was interrupted by a delegation from the village's religious authorities, who required his assistance in documenting a land transaction involving temple property. The relationship between religious institutions and imperial administration was one of the most complex aspects of Seleucid rule in Mesopotamia. Temples controlled significant agricultural resources and provided important services in education, record-keeping, and social welfare, but they also represented alternative sources of authority that could challenge imperial control. The scribe's role in documenting temple transactions required navigating between different systems of legitimacy, religious authority based on ancient traditions and divine sanction, and imperial authority based on military conquest and administrative efficiency. The documents he produced would need to satisfy both systems, creating records that could be defended in religious courts and administrative tribunals alike. The mathematical calculations required for tax assessment demonstrated the sophisticated accounting techniques that characterized Seleucid administration. The empire's fiscal system required not just recording the quantity of agricultural production, but calculating the various obligations that different categories of land and different types of producers owed to the imperial treasury. Royal land paid taxes at different rates than temple property, which was assessed differently from private holdings or military allotments. Military veterans who had received land grants in exchange for service paid reduced rates, but were subject to conscription obligations that needed to be tracked through the same administrative systems. The scribe's calculations had to account for these different categories while maintaining the precision necessary for imperial revenue collection, a task that required both mathematical skill and understanding of the complex legal categories that determine tax obligations. The afternoon brought correspondence from provincial officials requesting updated information about population figures, agricultural productivity, and potential military resources that might be required for campaigns against Parthian forces in the eastern provinces. The Seleucid Empire's military apparatus depended on the same administrative systems that collected taxes and maintained order in rural areas. The scribes' documentation provided the essential intelligence that allowed provincial governors to plan troop deployments, assess the availability of supplies, and determine which villages might be required to provide conscripts or logistical support. The connections between civilian administration and military planning meant that the scribe's daily work had implications that extended far beyond local village concerns, linking his small community to the empire's strategic calculations and international relationships. As the sun began to set over the palm groves that lined the river, Antiochus completed his day's documentation and prepared the tablets for transport to the regional administrative center. The routine had changed little since his appointment 5 years earlier, but he understood that his work was part of a vast system that connected Mesopotamian villages to imperial decision-making in ways that had never existed before the Macedonian conquest. The tablets he produced would eventually make their way to archives where they might be preserved for centuries, their cuneiform script providing future scholars with insights into the daily life of communities that had disappeared. But he also understood the fragility of the system he served. The empire's control over Mesopotamia depended on the willing participation of village scribes whose loyalty could not be guaranteed by military force alone. How long could the careful balance of Greek administrative efficiency and Mesopotamian social tradition be maintained before the contradictions between them became unsustainable? The challenge of cultural translation became most apparent when the scribe attempted to document legal transactions that involved concepts that existed in one tradition but not the other. The Greek legal categories that governed property ownership, for example, assumed individual rights that could be bought, sold, or transferred through market mechanisms. But Mesopotamian property law recognized collective ownership rights that belonged to families or clans, inalienable obligations to temples or religious institutions, and customary rights to water or grazing land that had been established through generations of use rather than formal legal process. The scribe's documentation had to create records that would be meaningful to Greek judges who might be called upon to resolve disputes while preserving the essential character of social relationships that predated Greek presence in the region by centuries. The religious dimension of village life created particular complications for the administrative documentation that the Seleucid system required. Mesopotamian religious traditions included practices that the Greek administration found difficult to categorize or regulate, divination procedures that seemed like superstition to rationalist Greek officials, temple rituals that involved behaviors that Greek law prohibited, inheritance patterns that were justified by reference to divine commands rather than human legal codes. The scribe's work required understanding both religious traditions well enough to translate between them without distorting either, a task that became more complex as Seleucid policy toward local religious practices shifted between accommodation and suppression depending on political circumstances and the personal preferences of individual administrators. The linguistic challenges extended beyond simple translation to involve different ways of understanding social relationships and obligations. The Greek concept of citizenship assumed a clear distinction between public and private life, between the individual's relationship to the state and their personal family or religious obligations. But Mesopotamian social organization blurred these distinctions. The same family relationships that governed inheritance patterns also created political alliances, religious responsibilities, and economic partnerships that could not be easily separated into different categories. The scribe's documentation had to capture these interconnected relationships while creating records that satisfied Greek administrative requirements for clear categorization and systematic organization of the economic integration of Mesopotamian villages into the wider Seleucid economy created new categories of transaction that required innovative documentation approaches. Traditional Mesopotamian commerce had been based on personal relationships and customary practices that assumed ongoing connections between trading partners whose families had conducted business for generations. But the Greek administrative system required standardized contracts, fixed prices, and impersonal arrangements that could be monitored and taxed by officials who had no personal knowledge of the parties involved. The scribe's work required creating documentation that satisfied Greek requirements for transparency and accountability while preserving the personal relationships and customary understandings that made Mesopotamian commerce function effectively. The question of legal jurisdiction became increasingly complex as different systems of law were applied to different categories of residents and different types of transactions. Greek citizens living in Mesopotamia were subject to Greek law administered through imperial courts, but native Mesopotamians continued to be governed by traditional legal codes administered through local institutions. The scribe's documentation had to anticipate which system of law might be applied to particular disputes and create records that would be admissible in whatever forum might eventually hear the case. This required understanding not just the substantive differences between legal systems, but the procedural requirements that determined how cases could be brought, what evidence would be considered, and what remedies might be available for different types of disputes. The integration of different timekeeping systems created practical challenges that affected every aspect of administrative documentation. The Greek administrative calendar, based on solar calculations that coordinated with festival schedules and agricultural cycles in the Aegean world, operated according to different rhythms than the Mesopotamian calendars that governed local agricultural activities and religious observances. The scribe's records had to be dated according to multiple systems: Greek administrative years, local agricultural seasons, religious festivals that determined when particular activities could or could not occur, and astronomical observations that affected everything from tax collection to military conscription. The ability to translate between these different systems of temporal organization became an essential skill for anyone working in Seleucid administration, requiring understanding of astronomical calculations, religious calendars, and agricultural cycles that had been developed independently in different cultural traditions. The question of administrative authority created ongoing tensions between different sources of legitimacy that competed for influence in village society. Traditional Mesopotamian authority was based on ancient lineage, religious sanction, and customary practices that were justified by reference to divine commands and historical precedent. Greek administrative authority was based on appointment by imperial officials, demonstrated competence in Greek language and administrative techniques, and loyalty to the Seleucid dynasty that had conquered the region through military force. The scribe occupied an ambiguous position in this competition for authority. His position depended on Greek appointment, and his effectiveness required Greek training. But his daily work required the cooperation of village leaders whose authority derived from very different sources. His documentation had to acknowledge these different systems of legitimacy while creating records that ultimately served imperial rather than local interests. As the empire's eastern borders became increasingly unstable due to conflicts with Parthian forces, the administrative systems that connected Mesopotamian villages to imperial decision-making became more important but also more vulnerable. The intelligence that village scribes collected about agricultural production, population figures, and military resources became essential for imperial planning. But the disruption of transportation networks and administrative hierarchies made it increasingly difficult to maintain the systematic documentation that the system required. The scribe's work became more urgent but also more difficult as the stable conditions that had supported systematic administration began to deteriorate. The tablets he produced continued to flow toward regional centers, but their arrival became less predictable, and their influence on imperial decision-making became less certain as the empire's resources were increasingly devoted to military campaigns rather than administrative maintenance. The preservation of different cultural traditions within the framework of imperial administration required constant negotiation between competing priorities that could not be easily reconciled. The Greek emphasis on individual achievement and competitive excellence conflicted with Mesopotamian values that emphasized collective responsibility and social harmony. The imperial requirement for systematic taxation and centralized control conflicted with local preferences for customary arrangements and traditional authority. The scribes' daily work required finding practical solutions to these theoretical conflicts, creating documentation that served imperial purposes without completely undermining local social structures. But he understood that these solutions were temporary, accommodations rather than permanent resolutions. The fundamental tensions between different ways of organizing human society remained unresolved beneath the surface of administrative routine. How long could these careful compromises be maintained before the contradictions between them became impossible to ignore? The accumulated weight of administrative documentation eventually reached proportions that challenged the capacity of the systems designed to manage it. The village scribes' daily production of clay tablets and papyrus documents represented only one small part of a vast imperial archive that grew exponentially with each passing year. The regional administrative centers that collected documentation from hundreds of village scribes found themselves struggling to house, organize, and access the enormous quantities of records that their subordinates produced. The very success of Seleucid administration, its ability to collect detailed information about every aspect of economic and social life throughout the empire, created logistical challenges that eventually threatened to overwhelm the administrative capacity that had made such collection possible. The bureaucratic systems that had been designed to manage imperial affairs became burdens that required increasing resources to maintain while providing diminishing returns in administrative effectiveness. The preservation of documents across different cultural traditions required understanding of preservation techniques that had been developed for different writing materials and storage systems. Clay tablets, if properly stored, could survive for millennia in Mesopotamia's dry climate, but they required physical space and organizational systems that became increasingly difficult to maintain as collections grew. Papyrus documents were more vulnerable to environmental damage, but were easier to transport and required less storage space. The documents that the scribe produced had to be prepared according to standards that would ensure their survival, but the resources required for proper preservation, suitable storage facilities, trained personnel, organizational systems that allowed documents to be located when needed became increasingly scarce as administrative priorities shifted toward military rather than archival concerns. The empire's administrative memory, carefully constructed over decades of systematic documentation, faced erosion through neglect rather than deliberate destruction. The question of access to administrative documents created challenges that reflected broader tensions between different concepts of knowledge and authority. The Greek tradition that informed Seleucid administration assumed that written documentation should be accessible to those who needed it for legitimate purposes, but Mesopotamian tradition treated certain types of knowledge as restricted to particular categories of people. The scribe's work required creating records that served administrative purposes while respecting cultural restrictions on who could access particular types of information. The tablets he produced contained economic intelligence, personal details about family relationships, and information about religious practices that different constituencies might consider sensitive for different reasons. The administrative system that required comprehensive documentation conflicted with social norms that restricted access to particular categories of knowledge, creating dilemmas that had no clear resolution within the existing frameworks of either Greek or Mesopotamian thought. The integration of different legal traditions required the creation of documentation that could function effectively across multiple systems of law and authority. A single land transaction might be subject to Greek civil law if disputed by Greek citizens, Mesopotamian customary law if contested by local residents, and imperial administrative regulations if it affected royal interests. The scribes' records had to anticipate these different forums and create documentation that would be persuasive in whatever context might eventually require it. This required legal knowledge that extended far beyond what village scribes could reasonably be expected to possess. But the administrative system provided no alternative mechanisms for creating records that served the complex jurisdictional requirements that Seleucid rule had created. The result was documentation that often satisfied no legal system completely, while creating confusion that undermined the administrative certainty that the system had been designed to provide. The administrative burdens imposed on local communities by imperial documentation requirements eventually reached levels that threatened the cooperation essential for the system's effectiveness. The time that villagers had to spend assisting with census taking, tax assessment, and legal documentation reduced the labor available for agricultural production and other economic activities that supported both local communities and imperial revenue collection. The scribe's work depended on the willing participation of village residents who provided information, assisted with document preparation, and cooperated with administrative procedures that often seemed irrelevant to their daily concerns. As administrative requirements became more complex and time-consuming, this cooperation became increasingly difficult to maintain, particularly during periods when agricultural or military demands already strained local resources. The administrative system faced the fundamental challenge that it required local cooperation to function effectively, but imposed burdens that made such cooperation increasingly burdensome. The political instability that characterized the later Seleucid period created conditions that made systematic documentation increasingly difficult to maintain. Military campaigns required resources that might otherwise have supported administrative activities, while the disruption of transportation networks and administrative hierarchies made it difficult to maintain the systematic collection and distribution of documents that the system required. The scribe's work became more urgent as imperial decision-making became more dependent on accurate information about local conditions. But the conditions that made such information essential also made it more difficult to collect and transmit. The tablets he produced continued to provide detailed information about village life, but their influence on imperial policy became less certain as the empire's resources became increasingly devoted to immediate survival rather than long-term administration. As the Seleucid Empire entered its final decades, the administrative systems that had connected Mesopotamian villages to imperial decision-making began to disintegrate under the pressure of internal division and external threat. The careful documentation that had characterized Seleucid administration for 2 centuries gave way to more sporadic and incomplete record-keeping as administrative resources were diverted to military purposes and trained personnel were lost to death, retirement, or defection to competing powers. The scribe continued his daily work, but he understood that the system he served was no longer capable of maintaining the systematic administration that had been its defining characteristic. The tablets he produced became increasingly disconnected from the imperial decision-making process, their detailed information about local conditions no longer flowing toward regional centers, where it could be integrated into larger patterns of policy and planning. The cultural synthesis that Seleucid administration had attempted to create, the integration of Greek administrative efficiency with Mesopotamian social traditions, proved to be more fragile than the empire's founders had anticipated. The careful compromises and practical accommodations that had allowed the system to function effectively required stable conditions and sufficient resources to maintain the complex procedures that cultural translation demanded. As political and economic stability deteriorated, these requirements became increasingly difficult to fulfill, and the contradictions between different ways of organizing social life became more difficult to reconcile through administrative procedures alone. The village scribe's work had represented an ambitious attempt to create a unified system of administration that could accommodate the diversity of the Hellenistic world. But the very complexity that made such accommodation possible also made it vulnerable to disruption when the conditions that supported careful compromise and systematic procedure no longer existed. What remained was not the synthesis that had been intended, but the separate cultural traditions that had been temporarily connected through the patient labor of administrators who had tried to make the contradictions between them manageable through the careful documentation of daily life. The morning heat rose from the bronze foundry's furnace like a living thing shimmering in the air above the workshop where Rhodian craftsmen had been producing metalwork for 3 centuries. You could measure the economic health of the Eastern Mediterranean by the activity in Rhodes bronze workshops. The demand for their products connected the island to trade networks that stretched from the Pillars of Heracles to the Indus Valley, creating a web of commercial relationships that made this small island one of the most important manufacturing centers in the Hellenistic world. The mastersmith, a third-generation craftsman named Dionysios, began his day with the same careful inspection of materials that his grandfather had performed when Alexander was still conquering Persia, checking the quality of copper ore from Cyprus and tin ingots that had traveled overland from distant Britain through trade routes that seemed as miraculous to him as they would to modern observers. The technical knowledge required for bronze production represented accumulated expertise that connected Rhodian workshops to technological traditions spanning the ancient world. The proportions of copper to tin, typically 9:1 for most applications, but varying for different types of artifacts, had been refined through experimentation that had destroyed as many pieces as it had perfected. The addition of trace elements, like lead for increased malleability or arsenic for improved hardness, required understanding that came only through the kind of patient observation that characterized pre-modern metallurgy. The smiths had learned which ores produced which characteristics, how the length of heating affected the final product, which cooling rates prevented the crystallization that could make bronze brittle and useless. This knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship systems that connected master craftsmen to younger workers, creating professional lineages that preserved technical expertise while gradually incorporating innovations that improved quality or reduced production costs. The workshop itself was a study in the organization of pre-industrial manufacturing. The various tasks required for bronze production, ore preparation, furnace operation, casting, finishing, were distributed among specialized workers whose expertise allowed for efficient division of labor. The furnace operators, men who understood the subtle art of maintaining temperatures that could exceed 1000 degrees Celsius using charcoal and bellows technology, were valued for skills that required years to develop and could not be easily replaced. The pattern makers who created the clay molds for casting understood geometry and spatial relationships well enough to design forms that would produce functional artifacts while accounting for the shrinkage that occurred as bronze cooled. The finishers who polished completed pieces using abrasives and chemical treatments knew techniques for creating surfaces that ranged from the mirror-like reflectivity required for decorative items to the textured finishes that provided grip for tools and weapons. The morning's first major task involved preparing a shipment of bronze fittings for ship construction, components that would be installed on vessels being built in Rhodes Harbor. The Rhodian fleet, famous throughout the Mediterranean for its role in suppressing piracy and maintaining commercial routes, required continuous replacement of parts that were damaged by exposure to salt water and mechanical stress. The bronze fittings, braces, hinges, cleats, and decorative elements had to be manufactured to specifications that allowed for interchangeability between different ships while maintaining the quality standards that made Rhodian naval architecture superior to most contemporary construction. The production required coordination with shipbuilders who provided technical drawings and installation schedules, creating manufacturing schedules that balanced the need for rapid delivery against the quality control that made Rhodian bronze products valuable throughout the Mediterranean. The economic integration of Rhodian bronze production with wider Mediterranean trade networks created relationships that connected the island's workshops to sources of raw materials and markets for finished products in ways that demonstrated the complexity of Hellenistic commerce. The copper ore came primarily from Cyprus, whose mines had been producing metal for over 2 millennia, and whose political relationships with roads had been carefully cultivated to ensure reliable access to high-quality materials. The tin required for bronze production arrived through trade routes that connected roads to distant sources in Britain, Spain, and Central Asia, creating dependencies on commercial relationships that might be disrupted by political changes or military conflicts in regions far from the Aegean. The island's central location made it an ideal transshipment point for these materials, but also created vulnerabilities to the piracy and warfare that periodically disrupted Mediterranean trade. The labor organization required for bronze production created social relationships that reflected the economic importance of manufacturing in Rhodian society. The craftsmen who worked in the foundries occupied a social position distinct from both the agricultural workers who produced food for the island's population and the merchants who managed the trade. Relationships that made Rhodian bronze products valuable throughout the Mediterranean. Their expertise commanded wages that allowed for participation in the island's political life, and the professional associations that connected different workshops provided organizational structures that influenced civic decision-making. The master craftsmen who supervised production often served as magistrates or council members, using their technical knowledge and commercial experience to inform policy decisions that affected Rhodes' economic relationships with other cities and kingdoms throughout the Hellenistic world. The technological aspects of bronze production required understanding of physical processes that were not fully understood in theoretical terms, but had been mastered through empirical observation and systematic experimentation. The smiths understood that certain combinations of metals produced particular characteristics, even if they could not explain these relationships in terms of atomic structure or chemical bonding. They had learned to control variables like temperature, timing, and atmospheric conditions to produce consistent results, developing quality control systems that allowed Rhodes to maintain its reputation for superior bronze products. The technical standards that emerged from this process became specifications that were recognized throughout the Mediterranean, creating brand recognition that allowed Rhodian bronze to command premium prices in markets where customers understood that the island's products represented reliable quality. The afternoon brought correspondence from merchants in distant ports who required bronze product for their local markets. These requests revealed the extent to which Rhodian bronze had become integrated into daily life throughout the Hellenistic world. Farmers in Italy needed agricultural tools, temples in Asia Minor required ceremonial vessels, households in Greece wanted cooking implements and decorative items. The variety of applications reflected the versatility of bronze as a material and the skill of Rhodian craftsmen in adapting their techniques to different requirements. Each request required consultation between merchants who understood market conditions and craftsmen who knew production capabilities, creating commercial relationships that balanced supply and demand across vast distances and diverse cultural contexts. As evening approached and the foundry's fires were banked for the night, Dionysios reviewed the day's production and contemplated the larger significance of the work his workshop performed. The bronze products that left Rhodes' harbors were more than mere commodities. They were the physical evidence of technological expertise, commercial relationships, and cultural connections that made the Hellenistic world function as an integrated economic system. The careful craftsmanship that characterized Rhodian bronze production represented accumulated knowledge that connected contemporary workshops to technological traditions spanning millennia. But he also understood the vulnerabilities inherent in the system his workshop served, the dependencies on distant sources of raw materials, the commercial relationships that might be disrupted by political changes, the technical knowledge that might be lost if apprenticeship systems were interrupted by social disruption. How long could the careful balance of technical expertise, commercial relationships, and political stability be maintained that made possible the production of bronze products that connected Rhodes to the wider Hellenistic world? The complexity of maintaining Rhodian bronze production required coordination with commercial networks that extended far beyond the island's immediate vicinity. creating relationships that connected Aegean workshops to sources of raw materials and markets for finished products throughout the known world. The tin that was essential for bronze production arrived through trade routes that demonstrated the remarkable integration of the ancient world's economy. Ships carrying British tin travelled along Atlantic coasts, through the pillars of Heracles across the western Mediterranean to ports where overland caravans transported the metal through Gaul and across the Alps to Italian markets, where Rhodian merchants purchased it for shipment to Aegean foundries. The journey might take months and involve dozens of intermediaries, each adding their own markup and creating documentation that traced the metal's movement from its origin in distant mines to its final destination in Rhodian workshops, where it would be combined with Cypriot copper to create bronze products. The financial instruments that facilitated this trade represented innovations that would influence commercial practice for centuries. The Rhodian Maritime Code, famous throughout the Mediterranean for its sophisticated approach to commercial law, provided frameworks for managing the risks inherent in long-distance trade. Contracts between merchants and ship owners specified responsibilities for different types of losses. Insurance arrangements distributed risks among multiple parties, and standardized procedures for resolving disputes reduced the transaction costs that might otherwise have made such complex trade impossible. The legal system that supported Rhodian bronze production had evolved to address the particular challenges of manufacturing trade, ensuring quality standards, managing relationships between suppliers and producers, providing mechanisms for resolving disputes that might arise from the long delays between order and delivery that characterized ancient manufacturing. The seasonal rhythms that governed Mediterranean trade created scheduling challenges that required careful coordination between different aspects of bronze production. The sailing season, typically running from March to October, determined when raw materials could be transported to Rhodes and when finished products could be shipped to foreign markets. But bronze production itself could continue year-round, requiring storage facilities for both raw materials and finished products, and creating inventory management challenges that connected production schedules to commercial calendars. The Rhodian merchants who specialized in bronze trade developed expertise in predicting seasonal patterns of supply and demand, creating commercial relationships that balanced the need for continuous production with the seasonal limitations that ancient transportation imposed on long-distance trade. The question of quality control became increasingly important as Rhodian bronze products became recognized throughout the Mediterranean for their superior craftsmanship. The development of technical standards that could be applied consistently across different workshops required coordination between craftsmen who might compete for the same markets but shared an interest in maintaining the island's collective reputation for quality. Professional associations emerged that established common standards for bronze composition, manufacturing techniques, and finishing procedures, creating systems of certification that allowed customers to identify authentic Rhodian products and avoid inferior imitations that might damage the island's commercial reputation. These quality control systems represented early forms of brand management, creating value for Rhodian products that extended beyond their functional characteristics to include the assurance of reliable performance that standardized production could provide. The integration of Rhodian bronze production with local economic development required understanding of how manufacturing activity affected other aspects of the island's economy. The wages paid to foundry workers created demand for agricultural products, housing and services that supported farmers, builders, and merchants whose activities were not directly connected to bronze production. The taxes collected from bronze workshops provided revenue for civic projects that improved harbors, roads, and public buildings that served the entire community. The international connections that bronze trade created brought visitors to the island who required accommodation, food, and entertainment, supporting the development of service industries that diversified Rhodes' economic base. The foundry workers who spent their days producing bronze artifacts were participating in economic relationships that connected their specialized labor to the broader prosperity of their community. The technological innovations that emerged from Rhodium bronze production often developed in response to specific commercial requirements that merchants communicated from distant markets. When customers in particular regions required bronze products with specific characteristics, tools that could withstand particular types of stress, decorative items that incorporated local artistic preferences, ceremonial objects that satisfied religious requirements. These specifications were communicated back to Rhodian workshops where craftsmen developed techniques for meeting these diverse requirements. The process created feedback loops that connected production techniques to market demands, ensuring that Rhodian bronze products remained competitive in markets where customers had access to alternative sources of supply. The innovation that characterized Rhodian bronze production was driven not by abstract technological curiosity, but by the practical requirement. The question of labor supply became increasingly important as Rhodian bronze production expanded to meet growing demand throughout the Mediterranean. The skills required for bronze craftsmanship could not be learned quickly, and the apprenticeship systems that transmitted technical knowledge required long-term commitments that became more difficult to maintain as economic opportunities expanded and social mobility increased. Some workshops responded by developing more systematic training programs that could produce qualified craftsmen more efficiently, while others focused on technological innovations that reduced the level of skill required for particular production processes. The result was a gradual transformation in the nature of bronze production that balanced the need for traditional craftsmanship with the requirements of expanded manufacturing capacity. The commercial intelligence required for successful bronze trade involved collecting information about market conditions, political developments, and technological innovations that might affect demand for Rhodian products. Merchants who specialized in bronze trade maintained correspondence with agents in major markets throughout the Mediterranean, creating networks of information exchange that connected the island to developments that might affect the demand for their products. This intelligence gathering was as important to commercial success as the technical expertise required for production. It allowed Rhodian merchants to anticipate changes in demand, adjust production schedules to match market conditions, and develop new products that responded to emerging opportunities. The information networks that supported Rhodian bronze trade represented early forms of market research, creating competitive advantages that allowed the island to maintain its position despite competition from other manufacturing centers. As another trading season reached its peak, Dionysios contemplated the remarkable integration that Rhodian bronze production represented. Technical expertise developed through generations of craftsmanship, commercial relationships that connected the island to markets throughout the Mediterranean, financial systems that managed the risks inherent in long-distance trade, and administrative procedures that ensured consistent quality and reliable delivery. The bronze products that left Rhodes harbors were physical manifestations of economic integration that had created prosperity for the island while serving the needs of communities throughout the Hellenistic world. But he also understood the vulnerabilities that this integration created, the dependencies on distant sources of raw materials, the commercial relationships that might be disrupted by political changes, the technical knowledge that might be lost if the systems that sustained its transmission were interrupted. How long could the delicate balance of technical expertise, commercial relationships, and political stability be maintained that made possible the production and distribution of bronze products that connected Rhodes to the wider Mediterranean world? The later years of Hellenistic bronze production revealed both the durability and the fragility of the systems that had connected Rhodian workshops to Mediterranean trade networks. The technical expertise that had been developed over generations proved remarkably resilient, surviving political changes, economic disruptions, and social transformations that affected other aspects of Rhodian society. The craftsmen who maintained bronze production through the transition from Hellenistic independence to Roman provincial status adapted their techniques to new market conditions while preserving the essential knowledge that made Rhodian products distinctive. The professional associations that had established quality standards and commercial procedures continued to function under Roman oversight, their accumulated expertise proving valuable to new political authorities who understood that the island's prosperity depended on maintaining the commercial relationships that had made Rhodes wealthy during its period of independence. The adaptation to Roman rule required modifications in administrative procedures and commercial relationships while preserving the essential characteristics that had made Rhodian bronze production successful. The Roman authorities who assumed control over the island recognized the value of the manufacturing and trading systems that had developed during the Hellenistic period, maintaining many of the administrative arrangements that had supported bronze production while adapting them to Roman legal and commercial practices. The transition was not without difficulties: new taxation systems, different procedures for resolving commercial disputes, and modified relationships with foreign markets required adjustments that tested the flexibility of established systems. But the fundamental approaches to quality control, market coordination, and technical training that had been developed during the Hellenistic period proved adaptable to new political circumstances, demonstrating the durability of the innovations that had emerged from generations of commercial experience, the technological knowledge that had been accumulated through centuries of bronze production did not disappear with the political changes that marked the end of the Hellenistic period, but was transmitted to new contexts where it continued to develop. The technical standards that had been established in Rhodian workshops influenced bronze production throughout the Roman Empire, creating manufacturing traditions that built upon Hellenistic innovations while incorporating new techniques and responding to different market conditions. The systems of quality control that had emerged from commercial necessity provided models for manufacturing organization that influenced production in other centers of bronze manufacturing, from Italian workshops that supplied the Roman army to provincial foundries that served local markets throughout the empire. The expertise that had been concentrated in Rhodian workshops became distributed throughout the Mediterranean world, its influence extending far beyond the island that had originally developed it. The commercial networks that had supported Rhodian bronze production adapted to new political realities while maintaining many of the fundamental relationships that had made them effective. The transition from Hellenistic kingdoms to Roman provincial administration created new opportunities for commercial integration, as Roman control over the entire Mediterranean eliminated many of the political barriers that had complicated long-distance trade during the Hellenistic period. The merchants who had specialized in bronze trade found new opportunities for expanding their operations under Roman rule, while the manufacturers who had developed expertise in Rhodian workshops found markets for their skills in other centers of production throughout the empire. The commercial relationships that had connected Rhodes to distant sources of raw materials and markets for finished products continued to function, but within a framework of Roman administration that provided greater stability and security than had existed during the competitive period of Hellenistic politics. The technical innovations that had emerged from Rhodian bronze production during the Hellenistic period continued to influence manufacturing techniques long after the political circumstances that had fostered their development had disappeared. The standardization procedures that had been developed to ensure consistent quality, the apprenticeship systems that had transmitted technical knowledge between generations, the quality control methods that had created brand recognition for Rhodian products, all these innovations contributed to the development of manufacturing organization throughout the Roman Empire. The tradition of bronze production that had been established in Rhodes continued to influence craftsmen who had no direct connection to the island, their techniques reflecting the accumulated expertise that had been developed during the Hellenistic period when Rhodes had been a major center of Mediterranean manufacturing. The technological legacy of Hellenistic bronze production became part of the broader heritage of ancient manufacturing that influenced industrial development throughout the classical period and beyond. The social organization of bronze production that had emerged during the Hellenistic period proved to be one of the most durable aspects of the system, continuing to influence the organization of manufacturing labor long after the specific commercial and political circumstances that had created it had changed. The professional associations that had connected craftsmen, merchants, and administrative officials provided organizational models that influenced the development of guild systems throughout the Roman Empire. Their procedures for maintaining quality standards and resolving commercial disputes becoming part of the institutional heritage that shaped medieval European manufacturing. The integration of technical expertise with commercial acumen that had characterized successful Rhodian bronze production continued to influence the development of manufacturing organization, creating traditions of craftsmanship that valued both technical skill and commercial competence as essential components of successful production. Elite administrative systems that had supported Hellenian bronze production during the Hellenistic period provided foundations for the development of Roman provincial administration. Their procedures for managing commercial relationships and maintaining quality standards influencing the development of imperial governance throughout the Mediterranean world. The legal frameworks that had been developed to resolve commercial disputes, the financial instruments that had facilitated long-distance trade, and the diplomatic protocols that had managed relationships between different political authorities all contributed to the development of Roman administrative practice. Their effectiveness proven through decades of practical application during the competitive period of Hellenistic politics. The bureaucratic innovations that had emerged from the necessity of managing complex manufacturing and trade. Relationships became part of the administrative heritage that influenced the development of Roman imperial government. As Rhodes entered its Roman period, the bronze production that had been its signature industry during the Hellenistic era continued to function, but within a changed context that reflected both continuity and transformation. The technical expertise, commercial relationships, and organizational systems that had been developed during the Hellenistic period remained valuable, providing foundations for continued prosperity under Roman rule. But the political independence that had allowed Rhodes to develop its distinctive approach to manufacturing and trade had disappeared, replaced by integration into the larger imperial system that connected the island to broader patterns of Mediterranean economic activity. The bronze smiths who continued their daily work understood that they were participating in traditions that connected them to the Hellenistic past, while serving the requirements of the Roman present. Their craft representing both the durability of technological skill and the adaptation required to survive political change. The foundries that continued to produce bronze artifacts served as reminders that the most durable achievements of the Hellenistic period were not the political conquests or cultural innovations that had attracted the attention of historians, but the patient development of technical expertise and organizational systems that could survive the transformation of the political circumstances that had originally fostered their creation. What lessons might their experience offer for understanding the relationship between technological development and political stability in the complex economic systems that connected the ancient Mediterranean world